Hello, everyone. Welcome to Artist in Studio Practice at the Library of Congress. It is truly energizing to see so many amazing humans in one room. Thank you guys so much for coming. My name is Stephanie Stillo. I'm Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division here at the Library of Congress. It is my true honor to introduce our speakers today and to kick us off with a few initial thoughts for the afternoon. But before I do this, I would like to offer a few very heartfelt words of gratitude. We would first like to thank the Airmount Charitable Foundation for their continued support of the Rare Book Division and their unwavering commitment to arts and education. We are truly privileged to have a sponsor that aligns so beautifully with the mission of the Library of Congress, which of course is to engage and inspire and inform. Next, I would like to thank all the people who helped us make this symposium a reality. A special thanks to Marianne Estelle for her amazing organizational prowess. Thank you, that is wonderful. As all of you know, we are all colleagues in some way in this room. These events are not easy, right? But you would never know that with Mariana at the helm. So we are very, very grateful to her. In addition, thank you to Patrick Hastings and members of the Chesapeake chapter of the American Printing History Association, and in particular, the ever wonderful Lauren Emirates, for their support. Wonderful. Thank you. For their support of the printing demo in the Rare Book Classroom earlier today. We're excited to work with AFA on really similar events in the near future, and we are beyond grateful for their generosity, wisdom, guidance, and patience as we establish our sea legs with the new printing press for the Library of Congress. As you explore the collection displays this afternoon, please give a warm thanks to everyone volunteering at a table. There was a lot of work that went into curating these displays, and I would like to give a special shout out to Callie Beatty and Stephanie Merkelbach, who are in the back working hard right now to organize everything, and they did a wonderful job of creating such a beautiful grouping of material for you to explore today. So today, we are going to be hearing from 3 speakers, all of whom are magical people. Starting us out with that. First up is Emily Moore. She is the Instruction and Outreach Archivist at the University of Oregon. She has an infectious passion for primary source research, which includes hands-on classroom instruction, research support, and community programming. Before the University of Oregon, Emily worked at the Library of Congress, first as a librarian in residence and then as assistant curator to the Airmount Library. During her time with us, she organized Making the Modern Book, which maybe some of you remember, which was a symposium spotlighting contemporary book artists and scholars from around the world. We are so lucky to have Emily in our continued orbit. Next up is Sarah Horowitz. Sarah is an artist based in beautiful Leavenworth, Washington, where she has her printmaking studio. Sarah previously lived in Portland, Oregon, where she was a member of the Atelier Mars printing studio. She also worked as a printmaking and drawing instructor at Portland State University. Sarah's work focuses on formal aesthetics in the natural world with an emphasis on ephemeral and memory. Her breathtaking prints, drawings, and artist books can be found in collections around the world. On a personal note about Sarah, I will say that there are not many people that can help you puzzle your way through a 15th century intaglio print, but I can say with experience that Sarah has helped me with exactly that, so we are delighted to have her here today. Last but certainly not least is Russell Moret. Russell is a book artist, type designer, and author based out of New York City. He began printing in San Francisco as a teenager before apprenticing with the one and only Peter Koch in Berkeley and Firefly Press in Somerville, Massachusetts. He set up his own press at the Center for Book Arts New York in 1993 and has been printing and publishing ever since. Thank goodness for all of us. In 1996, Russell began teaching himself to design letterform, leading to a 12-year odyssey that concluded with his first typeface in 2008. In 2009, Russell was awarded the Rome Prize in Design from the American Academy in Rome. He has been a resident in more prestigious institutions than I can mention, and is a notable and fierce advocate for the book arts community. The Library of Congress is also the proud repository of Russell's archive, some of which you will see this afternoon. So my colleagues have rightly reminded me that I am not allowed to abscond with the microphone too much this afternoon, but they gave it to me. So I'm going to offer us just a few thoughts to center us before moving forward with the rest of the program today. I'm going to do this with a story, and it's a story that is very much inspired by the topic of one of our speakers today. In 1933, when the Nazis forced the closing of the Berlin Bauhaus, artists Joseph and Annie Albers moved to the United States to start a new artist community in the town of Black Mountain, situated at the feet of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. It was there that Joseph Albers began teaching his famous classes on human perceptions of color. The Albers explored a simple but almost mystical phenomenon. When certain colors are placed next to one another in different combinations, they change. They become cooler or warmer. They can become muted. Sometimes they all but disappear. However, with the right combination, what Albers called the right optical mixture, colors elevate one another. They harmonize and they strengthen. They become more than the sum of their parts. Albers believed that color was a metaphor for social behavior and, more importantly, for community. Just like color, when people are placed in the right context, they elevate one another and harmonize. They simply burn brighter. I would like to pose the suggestion that today is not simply a gathering of people exploring the topic of studio practice. Instead, we are together a real-life example of Albers' optical mixture. Together, we are more than the sum of our individual parts. We are a living and vibrant community. Through our mutual love of books and the arts, we elevate one another, and our collective interests harmonize. It is in this spirit of camaraderie that I once again warmly welcome you to the Library of Congress, to this symposium, to your community. As we listen to our colleagues this afternoon, as we raise glasses in celebration, let us not forget the larger meaning of our gathering, which is to nourish and to be nourished by our amazing optical mixture. Now, with that out of the way, I have the great pleasure of inviting our first speaker to the stage, the one and only Emily Moore.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Moore, and I am so honored to be here today, kicking off this series of really wonderful conversations. Like many of you, my professional and intellectual lives are grounded in the world of books. I have worked as a curator, overseeing the phenomenal, unbelievable, singular Aramount Library here at the Library of Congress. I have worked as an archivist, handling the collections of artists and institutions, and I now work as an educator, where I help teachers and faculty integrate rare and unique materials into their pedagogy. But personally, I approach the book through dual lenses, that of art history and effective engagement. I'm compelled by the book's visual, material, and historical presence, but also by its more intimate and cognitive dimensions. The book is both object and agent. It is an artifact to be held and collected and preserved, but at the same time, it is a catalyst. It's an activator of the reader's mind. It offers a complex terrain where material form, intellectual content, and cultural context converge. They are objects that create cognitive architectures. We read in so many ways. We read on our phones, scrolling through the emails and messages and updates of our professional lives. We read with paperbacks curled up on our sides in bed. We read in whispered tones to our children. And in each case, reading is not merely a mental act, but also a spatial, embodied, and creative one. Consider posture. Are you hunched up over a glowing screen on a cramped flight? Or maybe you're upright at a library table over a giant folio like the Ulysses that you see on the screen here. And with each mode of reading, the format and context of our texts affects us cognitively, physically, and socially. And as such, each text requires a unique type of literacy, an approach dictated by form, but then refined by reader. So what does reading do? How does it shape our lives and structure our bodies and our cognitive selves? These are large questions, and the answers are going to depend largely on the type of text that we're exploring. So this afternoon, I invite you to consider a specific type of book, books that you might hear referred to as livres d'artistes or artist books, but essentially we're going to be looking at works in which text and image are integrated with an intentional materiality. Books that function both as artistic objects, but also sites of conceptual engagement. Books of this kind do not merely represent culture or emotion, concepts, they enact all of them. They function as cultural containers that synthesize multiple creative disciplines, writing, printing, illustration, papermaking, bookbinding, into collaborative multimodal artifacts. So take the image you see here. What exactly is it that we're looking at? We see a woman's portrait. It's repeated and insistent, but it's also flattened, stacked, and refuses to meet our gaze. The sparse text next to it translates to something like a wall-piercing face, which I do think is an apt description of its paired image. In word and line, what you're seeing here is a portrait of a woman named Gala, who is the focal point of this entire book, which was written by her husband, the poet Paul Eluard, and then illustrated by their lover, Max Ernst. This book, Au défaut de silence, was published in 1925, and it embodies the emotional capacities of livres d'artistes through bringing together multiple creatives and giving them a pretty wild arena to experiment in. As products of such creative intimacies, these books are designed not only to be viewed, but to be handled, to be held and experienced. An intimacy here initially created by Gala, Paul, and Max, and then shared with us through text and image. This type of book engages us intellectually and emotionally. They stimulate cognition through their complexity, which is visual and narrative and material. And in doing so, they activate the reader's capacity for attentiveness and contemplation. This is how they become spaces of co-creation, where meaning is not imposed, but rather discovered through the acts of reading and looking. When closed, a book is latent, it's quiet, it's filled with potential. And then when it's opened, it becomes dialogic, a shared space between maker and reader. So these books are not static objects, they are touchstones that are flexible and faceted in their invitation to us to interpret and wonder. Another compelling case study is Le Corbusier's poem of the Right Angle, published by Thiriade in 1955. This work exemplifies the ways in which a book can function architecturally, organizing not only space but also experience. Created over a period of 7 years, the poem is a convergence of disciplines: architecture, painting, philosophy, and poetry. It consists of 19 lithographs that are each paired with a blend of text, whether it's free verse or aphoristic prose, that together form 7 thematic stations that are each assigned a color. It's complicated. But we can think of it as a kind of didactic object, one that teaches us through the encounter. And as such, it reflects Le Corbusier's belief that experiencing of touching and of reading should elevate and educate the human spirit, much like architecture itself. So we're going to take a look at a print from each of the stations with some of the accompanying text. And each station reflects an essential aspect of Le Corbusier's worldview. So the first, milieu, represents the environment. This is a layered concept of spatial orientation and solidarity with nature. It speaks to time, balance, and the primacy of the natural world. He also introduces visually the horizon line along with the right angle, which is a theme that's echoed throughout the book, here acting as the container of the seas as well as the borderland of our perceptions. That's followed by the second station of esprit, which is the human mind and consciousness. This station reflects our creative and intellectual capacities. Here, Le Corbusier advocates for the human interventions of building and thought. It celebrates imagination, invention, and transformation, as well as the tools of architecture, mathematics, and indeed books that we can use to interpret and understand the world around us. This is followed by char, the body. So where esprit is going to be more cerebral, char is more visceral. It speaks to embodiment, sensation, and mortality, but also tenderness and love. It reminds us that the human experience is not just conceptual, it's embodied and deeply felt. And next we have fusion, which is where appropriately things begin to merge. This station is about communion, reconciliation, and the transformation of opposites. In this section, image and text, reader and object are all encouraged to kind of blur and become something greater than the sum of their parts. This is mostly, for me at least, the most abstract section of the text, which frankly I find inviting or alienating, depending on who I am that day. And as such, I think this section really skillfully demonstrates the potent capacity that exists when reader and book come together. The creation of a third space of interpretation that is only possible in union, that also changes over time. This is followed by caractère, which is where identity comes into focus. Here, Le Corbusier meditates on the essence of things and how being can be structured through action. He returns to the visuals of the horizon line and the right angle, this time using them as representations of moral countenance. This moral philosophical line and angle then serve as corollaries to the lines of angles of buildings and architecture, which is where Le Corbusier reflects on his own character and intent, seeing himself not just as a builder of objects, but as someone who becomes through the making. Then we have offre, which is where we encounter the open hand, a central symbol in Le Corbusier's work. It stands for generosity, reciprocity, and creative agency. The hand shapes, it senses, it gives. It represents human freedom and the ability to grasp complexity and transform it through design. And then finally we have utile, which is the return and the final reflection on the right angle itself, a tool and symbol of rational structure, order, and human agency. For Le Corbusier, the tool is both a literal and metaphorical instrument. It's our response to the chaos of nature and then also our way to impose and structure meaning. So the poem is not simply illustrative, it is experiential. Its physical form and spatial arrangement invite the reader to construct a symbolic model of Le Corbusier's metaphysical universe out of the book's prints, which you can see on the screen here. And in doing so, the book acts not just as a container of ideas, but as an environment for thinking, a cognitive architecture that only comes into view via the participation, both physical and cognitive, of the reader. And in this way, Le Corbusier is acting not just on our brains, but also on our bodies. These types of books compel a heightened attentiveness, not only through their content, but also through their form. They make demands on us. We must navigate scale, texture, structure, and sequencing. Take, for example, the work of Sarah Horowitz, whose single edition book, Timeline, maps ecological instability by transforming landscape into visual narrative. In Timeline, Horowitz employs landscape as a metaphor for a temporal continuum, visually articulating the accelerating impacts of climate change. Often perceived as static and enduring, in Timeline, geological features are reinterpreted as dynamic and vulnerable to rapid transformation. The depiction reflects how extreme events can initiate a cascade of environmental consequences, underscoring the landscape's increasing instability. The physicality of Horowitz's practice and her literal scaling of mountains and practice of drawing in situ is embedded in this work. The drawing serving as both a record of a very specific moment in time and also as an exploration of time's spatial dimensions. In addition to line, color also functions conceptually and temporally. In Russell Moret's Colored Objects, an interpretation of a section of Goethe's theory of colors, the reader's experience of color takes center stage, allowing us to understand that how something is experienced can in fact operate separately from our actual cognitive processes. There is an embrace of the space between how something is perceived versus how it operates, as well as an allowance for, and indeed an insistence on, the awareness of time's capacity to produce sensation. To fully experience Moret's intended visual effects, the reader must slow their pace and spend deliberate time with each page. And to encourage this slower engagement, Maret uses the rapid stencil typeface, which is composed entirely of capital letters, which naturally slows the reading process. The book becomes a site of experimentation, where reading is both a perceptual and intellectual activity. The immersive quality is further enhanced by colored glasses, layered pages, interactive pullouts that require the physical manipulation to access or reveal certain images and content. And as a result, reading becomes a tactile, time-based experience that engages the senses as much as the mind. This attentiveness to perception, temporality, and reader engagement in colored objects finds a compelling analog in the kinetic and participatory qualities of Man Ray's Revolving Doors. While Maret's work invites introspection through the durational acts of viewing and the physiological effects of color, Ray's compositions similarly foreground the viewer's embodied experience, this time through physical interaction and spatial movement. Both products underscore a shift away from static representation towards a more dynamic visuality, where meaning emerges not solely through image or text, but through process, sensation, and time. Originally conceived as a series of paper collages, Revolving Doors found an extended life as a sequence of prints. A key aspect of their original presentation was their mode of display. Suspended within a gallery space, the prints were allowed to move with the ambient air, physically enacting the notion of their revolving title. Viewers were further invited to interact with the work directly, introducing an element of co-authorship, as well as highlighting Ray's exploration of movement as a fourth dimension of visual experience. Ray's formal strategies further emphasize this dynamism. Through sharp color transitions, the integration of energetic lines and squiggles and overlapping shapes, he created a sense of motion and interrelation between forms. Here, for example, we have an orchestra, a full body of instruments compressed into a single object, their visual unification akin to the sound they create. So these books are not only multimodal, they are also temporal objects and can reference the entire arc of book history, from cuneiform to Kindle and everything in between. Consider Maret's Ethowat, etc., an alphabetical treatise rooted in a constellation of influences. Blending aesthetic sophistication with a functional legibility, Maret's letter forms draw inspirations from sources as varied as Byzantine weavings to the architectural pavement designs of Siena's Duomo. Or maybe some, as we see here on the screen, are realized through unexpected mediums of fire, burned matches, and singed paper, each influence serving as a catalyst for typographic exploration. His engagement with illuminated texts, poetic language, and even medieval music reflects his view of the alphabet not just as a tool for communication, but as a site of cultural memory and imaginative transformation. Within this constellation of influences, Ethowat, etc. stands out as a paradigmatic object, one that exemplifies the layered approach of Maret's work and affirms the enduring power of historic models to inspire contemporary bibliographic experimentation. So these objects can behave as temporal palimpsests, collapsing centuries of bookmaking practice into a present tense encounter. They are both ancient and contemporary, their layered references inviting readers into a conceptual arena, a shared intellectual and imaginative space that persists beyond the moment of reading. So to return to our initial question, what is it that books do? They anchor us in the present moment while also situating us within broad historical and cultural continua. They make us aware of our own cognitive processes and invite us into acts of collaborative meaning-making. They transcend passive reading. The reader becomes co-creator, engaging physically and intellectually with a multifaceted object. These books foster empathy, curiosity, and interpretive openness. And perhaps most fundamentally, they reaffirm the power of the book, not as a singular technology, but as an enduring, evolving medium for human thought, expression, and communion. So you need not choose one way of reading or one type of book. This just suggests just read. These are objects that invite and reward return. They evolve as we evolve. Interpretation is iterative. So read with your eyes, read with your hands, read with your whole attention. Thank you.
My name is Sarah Horowitz. Thank you, Mariana. All right. I am so honored to be here with you in this amazing company. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for inviting me here, and especially for our wonderful conversations about books and prints. Okay, it's all working. I structured this talk in the nonlinear way I approach making a book and made a mind map to keep track of all the parts. The process is a lot like weaving, or at least what I imagine it would be like to weave, with many strands coming in from all different directions. I weave together histories and ideas with the visual aesthetic or feeling I am hoping to achieve, and then add in the technical aspects of creating flow with elements like page sequence, text placement, printing techniques, and binding structure. The goal is to create a cohesive book without any one element taking over. I'm going to talk about making my book Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is a Slavic witch of fairy tales who lives in a house on chicken legs, flies about in a mortar with a pestle for steering and a broom to sweep away her tracks. She has a reputation for setting people impossible tasks and eating children. In this version, the kind girl escapes Baba Yaga with the aid of the cat, who gives her a towel and a comb to throw on the ground behind her. They transform into a river and a dense forest, respectively, preventing Baba Yaga from catching her. Bringing together strands from my past. My mom is from Basel, Switzerland, and I grew up with the aesthetics of Swiss design and particularly kids' books. My grandfather and his father were printers and ran the local press. They published books in the regional newspaper called De Riene Zeitung. This was Schudeldruck, my grandfather Albert Schudel's print shop in Riene. And here's another shot of the interior of the shop. My parental family came from Hungary and White Russia. They were Jews who emigrated to New York around the 1890s during the pogroms. I'm intrigued by my ancestors' texts, stories, and histories. The idea that Judaism is a text-based faith and a culture has continued to resonate with me and influences my work. One of my favorite writers, Edmond Jabé, a Cairo-born Jewish poet, wrote in the Book of Questions, "I am in the book. The book is my world, my country, my roof, and my riddle. The book is my breath and my rest." As a kid, my favorite books were short stories of all kinds: Greek and Norse myths, European fairy tales, and Jewish folk tales. I kept a book of Grimm's fairy tales stashed under my desk and read stories when I was supposed to be doing my math homework. I thought I would be a kid's book illustrator. Baba Yaga was one of my favorite stories, and I always imagined it being illustrated with paper cuts like these from a recent Brothers Grimm's edition illustrated by Andrea Dessau. I don't know if I saw a version like that. That's completely not what I did, but that's what I imagined in my head for decades. Moving a little further forward in time, I went to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, where I studied math and art. My math professor, Ken Hoffman, was also a naturalist. We went on tree walks every Wednesday at 7:30. That was a stretch for me. I learned to make etchings and woodcuts with Charlie Hewitt at the Chautauqua School of Art in upstate New York during the summer after my junior year of college. Printmaking blew open the possibilities of art making for me. The limitations of working on metal and wood with just marks and lines taught me how to draw. The premise of printmaking is to create a matrix so you have identical multiples, kind of like old-fashioned photocopying. This was a key tool in me later being able to make artist books. While living in Western Massachusetts, which is a major artist book hub, I was exposed to incredible books like those of Leonard Baskin and his Gehenna Press and William Morris's Chaucer. Leonard Baskin lived in the area and taught at Smith College earlier in his career. I met him and was his last art critique before he passed away in 1999. His wife, Lisa Baskin, and family, Hosey and Sarah, have given me essential guidance and support ever since that time. And this is Leonard Baskin's Charles Brand etching press that I now have in my studio. Turning point. I received an artist residency in Belwald, Switzerland in 2017 with an apartment and a studio. Belwald is a German-speaking town in the canton of Wallis, high on the ridge above the Rhone Valley. The appearance of various regions in Switzerland are defined by their local building materials. So in Belwald, the main material is larch wood, and it darkens with age. These buildings are 500-year-old grain storage barns that were constructed on stilts to keep them free of rodents. Some of them have been renovated for other kinds of use. These historic buildings directly inspired me to take on this long-awaited Baba Yaga project. This looks like a witch's house, right? I began collecting ideas and images. For example, Swiss houses on stilts. My very old 99-year-old grandmother happens to be with my 5-month-old daughter, who's now almost 13. My neighbor's chickens, especially pictures of their feet. The Pacific Northwest forest, my equivalent of the Russian forest. This is basically my backyard. Children's books with horizontal layouts and vertical layouts, text top and bottom, staggered left and right, and various translations and versions of Baba Yaga, thanks to my friend and professor of Russian, John Stone. The text I ended up using was an 1887 translation by W.R.S. Ralston from the original collected by Alexander Afanasev, which was in the public domain, accessible through the Gutenberg Project website. Afanasev was a Russian ethnographer who published almost 600 folk and fairy tales, known as skazki. Much like the Grimm's brothers in Germany, several ethnographers in the Slavic countries collected regional stories during the mid-19th century. I wanted Baba Yaga to be personal, and so I situated it in my local landscape. I see the regional geology and native botany as an important aspect of a place's identity. The town I live in, Leavenworth, Washington, is 2 hours from Seattle on the eastern side of the Cascade Mountains, so we get snow, not rain. I don't know if you can tell, it's actually a faux Bavarian tourist town, so it's all fake chalets. This was not the part I was drawing. The town sits on, the land the town sits on belongs to the Wenatchee tribe, known as the Pascosa in their own language, is situated near the confluence of the Wenatchee River and the Icicle River, the site of their traditional fishing grounds. I love drawing the ponderosa pines, quaking aspens, and Nootka roses that are native here, so I wanted to include them in the book. Technical aspects of making a book. As I began to actually make images, print pages, and work on my narrative layout, I ran into some limitations of my medium, namely the impression of the etching plate in the paper called the plate mark, and where to put my text. I made etchings which are called intaglio prints. This is a term for images incised into the surface like a copper plate. It's the reverse of a relief print where you print from the surface like a stamp or a woodcut. I'm going to show you 2 short videos now. One is making how I prepare a plate in the traditional method, and then the second is printing a plate two-sided etching. I work on thin gauge industrial copper that I buy in large sheets and have cut down. That way it fits into my tiny 22-inch Pexto stomp shear. Once my plates are cut, I polish them with fine gauge steel wool and degrease my plates with whiting and a combo of vinegar and salt to get any remaining oils off them. I dry off the plate and place it on my hot plate. I melt Charbonnel ball hard ground onto the hot plate and roll it out with a leather brayer. The last step is to smoke the plate. I have to take it outside since my studio is super small and I don't have space to do this indoors. It's really tricky when it's windy. I use a wax taper to burn the hard ground. This turns the ground black so I can see the marks I make when I'm drawing. Now my plate is ready to be drawn on. Oh, there we go. Okay, and there's one more. Yes, my hot plate is a pancake griddle. When printing books, I frequently have to print on both sides of a sheet of paper. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I print back-to-back etchings. Here I'm setting up my registration using the T-bar system from lithography. Now I'm wetting down my paper for a damp pack. I use barrier cream to protect my hands since I don't print with gloves. I use a combo of Gamblin Portland Cool Black ink and Charbonnel Universal Black for printing usually. I sometimes also add in tack reducer if I have large plates. Here I'm inking up plate number 1. First I scrape on the ink, removing any excess that I can. Next is buffing it off with the tarlatan. I wish I could print that fast. The last step is to hand wipe the plate, and I use some whiting powder. I place the first plate on the press bed, and then it's time to ink up plate number 2. Now I'm going to get my paper that's been soaking in the meantime and dry it off with a towel. And I'm going to register it on top of the first plate. Since it's a bleed plate and I don't want to print on my blankets, I'm covering it with a piece of tissue. Here we have the first print. I'm printing both my plates back to back because the paper is still damp. So swapping out the etching plates, putting the first print on top of the second plate and covering it with tissue so that it doesn't offset onto my blankets. I now have the first folio printed back to back with 2 etchings. So that's a little look into my studio and how I print these plates. So I'm getting all set up to do this, and then things fell apart. I dove into making etchings, but ran into several issues stemming from the fact that I was trying to create a book based on my assumptions of what the book should be, rather than being present and noticing where the process was taking me. I was shoving a square peg into a round hole. The etchings I made so far weren't working. I wasn't used to drawing houses or animals or people. The composition was stiff, and I didn't account for the background because I thought I could just fill it in with lots of pine branches. But drawing thousands of pine needles wasn't happening either. This is one of my rejections. And the woodcut version I also started, that wasn't working. So I loved the way the horizontal pages, horizontal page plates looked. And so you can see the plate mark at the bottom of the image, but they broke up the flow. Since I was printing my images back to back, I was ending up with a plate mark through the middle of a page where I needed a vertical image. That led to awkward spaces for the text, and it's poor form to put a text on the back of an etching. You get the text impression coming through the image. Lastly, it was just too much symbolism and felt fairly forced. So I started over. After almost a year into research and trying to make images, I decided to start over. I prepared several new plates and just tried to make drawings while letting go of my assumptions and how things should look. It was kind of like an obligatory mindfulness practice. Eventually, some things started working. I began using plants as a narrative thread instead of using them to represent a place. The book began with invasive toxic plants, and towards the end, it's taken over by beneficial, non-toxic, even edible plants. Basically, I just drew the plants I loved. I simplified my structure to all full bleed plates, both single and full spreads. That meant no visible plate marks, aside from those that lined up with the center fold. I allowed my Baba Yaga to be more ambiguous, rather than all evil. Depending on the story, and there are many, she isn't always evil. She reflects society's perception of aging women in various ways, including as a witch, but she also embodies the crone and the wild woman of the forest. I began playing with a sort of magical realism, allowing the scales of people, objects, and plants to vary. Mostly it was an excuse to draw really big flowers and rose hips when I wasn't sure what else to do. So what began to come together? A rhythm of image back to back with image and text with text began to emerge. I found a trio of gouache colors that reminded me of the traditional artwork, colors that allowed me to dramatize the narrative thread with hand coloring. I found a typeface I loved. Myola was designed by Czech designer Veronika Burian from Type Together. It was based on early Czech type design with calligraphic characteristics and nuances. I liked the connection to handwriting. The binding decisions happened fairly easily. When I can't find a cloth or a paper that I like to use for the book, I make an etching with patterns and print it on colored paper that works well for binding, usually Hanamili Bugra. I was really happy with how the cover and end sheet plates turned out. So my real job is problem solving. I would say that 50% of what, or more, of what I do is problem solving. Rarely does a drawing, book, or print come out the way I see it in my mind's eye. There can be big, obvious issues like paper that won't dry flat, or less concrete challenges like drawings feeling stiff and stilted. In the process of making a mock-up of Baba Yaga for Codex Book Fair, I realized I was missing a spread because the sequence of the Furious Witch was too rushed. That meant adding in a page which threw off my perfected rhythm of image and text, but I had to find a way to make it work. Art is a practice, literally. I am always practicing and continuing to learn more about printing and drawing. Problem solving is a practice too, trying all kinds of ideas over and over again, turning things upside down to get a better view. I think I'm getting better at it. See? Next steps. My next step, now that this book is done, is to make another book. To be honest, I'm actually making 3. But the next book is a book of sunflower etchings I'm calling a sunflower florilegium. A florilegium is literally a gathering of flowers, but refers to collections of excerpts, writings, which is very appropriate since it will be a collection of various types of sunflowers with poems, history, stories, and scientific information on sunflowers. I thought about making a 5-foot-tall book, but can you imagine trying to get that onto an airplane? Instead, I've come up with a design that has fold-out spreads to accommodate extra tall or wide prints. So folding up or out. I can only guess at all the things that are going to go wrong and how my letterpress printer, Art Larson, will be shaking his head. For that matter, I'm not sure this book is going to look like this at all. But if you have any recommendations for texts on sunflowers, I'm still looking for suggestions. All languages and formats are welcome. And finally, I'm ending with this bouquet of flowers, which is also the concluding image of my book. And thank you so, so much.
Hard to follow that. All right. So I'm going to be discussing the making of my book, Colored Objects, which Emily referred to earlier. But the book will make more sense in relation to my studio practice if I begin with a little background. And for me, there's no better place to start than with what I consider to be my ideal book. Everybody's got their version of that. And for me, what it means is that it's a book in which every mark within the book was made by me. I don't think that's egotistical. It's like how come on. It's like what I do. It's and so what this means is that for each book I make, I usually design the typefaces and letter forms. I make the images. I draw the ornaments, and when it's appropriate, I write the text. I do whatever I need to do to realize the book that I want to make. So in as much as I have a studio practice, it's predicated on change, and it's always conceived as a process of learning. And so on any given day, I might be designing on the computer. That's meant to be like that. That is an image of like, yeah. I might be setting type. I could be drawing with candle smoke, cutting a linoleum block, which I'm doing more and more of these days for some reason, or cranking a press. And I wanted to show you a picture of me before I started dyeing my hair gray. But what unites my books is that the means by which I make them, so the alphabets, the ink colors, and the geometry, are also my subject matter, or at least they've become so over time. And the process of learning what I wanted to make was slow and difficult. I began printing in 1989, and it wasn't until 2008 that I made a book that came close to my ideal. The previous year, my wife, Annie, who was not my wife at the time, gave me a Baedeker guide to northern Italy, and I spent weeks soaking in its grand tour mystique. And while reading about the collections of inscriptions in Padua, I had a flash of insight that in retrospect sounds pretty simple. But it changed everything for me. I suddenly understood, and this actually echoes something Sarah said, that I had been thinking too much about what I assumed other people wanted my books to be. Inasmuch as I appeared in my books, I was tucked in behind the expectation of these imaginary others. And as I looked back on the history of the book, I realized that what I loved about my favorite books is the way in which their printers broke with convention. What I loved about these printers' books, what I loved was what these printers' books revealed about themselves. I don't love the Kelmscott Chaucer because of Chaucer. I love it because of William Morris, because it so thoroughly embodies his passions that when I look at it, I'm right there with him. And what Morris had to teach me was not to make books that mimicked his passions, but to make ones that celebrated my own. And the book that came out of this epiphany, Medieval in Padua, is small and slim and full of errors, but it had an outsized impact on my work. It was the first book I published in which I wrote the text and designed the type, drew renderings of historical letter forms, I photographed the images of historic inscriptions, and I indulged my love of color printing by printing a 7-color map of Padua, of which this is a detail. I don't know how well you can see it. They're very faint colors. But by the time I finished printing Medieval in Padua, my entire approach to bookmaking had changed. It's also what finally got me wearing glasses. The next year, I printed Ethelwald, Etc., a book that used a maximalist approach to my love of letter forms and color printing. I designed 5 typefaces for the book and 26 portraits of letter forms that required about 160 different ink colors to realize. The method of color printing that I was most enthused about involved printing layers of color on top of one another using a variety of digital and hand-drawn imagery to create painterly or otherwise unusual effects. So this is T for Truth, which has the last stanza of Ode on a Grecian Urn running through it. P for Prometheus, which is the exterior is a 3-color separation made from an actual drawing I made by burning matches on paper. And then the P itself is a chi adopted from a Visigothic tile, et cetera, et cetera. And then this is my R for Rimbaud, which rather than having an R is composed of me writing his name thousands of times and printing it in 6 different colors, in 6 different densities of pen. And so I continued to develop these techniques from Ethelwald in 2 other books, Specimens of Diverse Characters. Here's the close-up of the Rimbaud page. There's a cast of characters that sort of runs through my work. And then finally, Interstices and Intersections, or An Autodidact Comprehends a Cube. And to give you a sense of what this method of printing involves, I'll just take you through the printing of the Nautilus shell from Interstices and Intersections. Can you guys see this on my screen? They're very washed out, but yeah, okay. Because it gets even more washed out. So first we'll start with there's my original pencil drawing in the middle there of the Nautilus shell, and then a photograph to its left, a photograph of an actual Nautilus shell with what I imagined were some printing notes on it, and then to the lower right, the pencil drawing of the sort of zebra striping that I made from that photograph. And one of the things I love about this method of printing this image was what I call the secret press runs, which are press runs of color. I don't know if everyone here knows, but for every color that I print, I think this is 9, I have to mix an ink, put a different plate on the press, ink up the press, print it, clean the press, and start over. So there are certain press runs, including the first one, that I call secret press runs, which you can't really see, but they make all the difference for the final image. So what you're seeing or not seeing is the ground that gives the outline of the shape. And then it's printed on with this sort of terracotta orange, which again is a plate made from this drawing. And then it's printed on. And then there's the next secret press run, which you definitely can't see because it's in white ink. But there it goes. And now look at the effect of it. We go from there to there. It's completely changed the image and given me what I want, but it's an ink that you can't see otherwise. Then there's another secret press run, which when printed starts the separation of interior and exterior of the shell. Another one that's slightly darker, which continues that process. And then we need to get some volume going. And so there's this image. And to just give you a sense of what my artistic draftsmanship is like, this print comes from this drawing. And then you print it there and you start to get a little of the rounding of the shell. We need a little more separation from the interior and a little shadow. We need to change that color to give it a little blue. And then there's final graphite, and that's your image. So I made Ethelwald, etc. in 2009 and this in 2014. And so by the time I finished printing this, I felt I had taken this method of printing as far as I could, and I haven't used it since. But it wasn't that I wanted to give up printing color, it was just that I needed to experiment with new ways of doing it. My first attempt at this was a little book called Some Problems with Red, which consists of 5 brief texts that I wrote about the difficulties in describing and reproducing color, each of which is paired with an image printed from a different material. It was sort of like a learning, like a class that I gave myself. And this spread is my favorite. It's printed from metal type ornaments in 8 colors that are printed intentionally out of register to get these. And I think of it as a portrait of the color red as we experience it over time as we move through space. And as you can see, every print is considerably different from every other one. But what made Some Problems with Red different from my previous books was that it turned color decisively from method to subject matter. And more than any other book, Some Problems with Red paved the way for colored objects. So I bought a paperback of Goethe's Theory of Colors 15 or 20 years ago, and I dip into it from time to time. If someone can read it all the way through, they deserve some sort of prize. But so it's not something I study so much as savor. And every time I read his text, I come away both excited and mystified. There's a quality of Goethe's descriptive language that sounds as if he's only a few generations removed from a Greek doctor who describes your blood as one of your 4 humors. In his section on pathological colors, for instance, Goethe tells us that, quote, a person suffering from an earache saw sparks and balls of light in the eye, end quote. And then he says, and hypochondriacs frequently see dark objects such as threads, hairs, spiders, flies, wasps, end quote. And I love the thought of Goethe. I don't know if any of you know, but Goethe loved colorful, patterned clothing. And he would get himself all gussied up in these outfits. And I love the thought of him standing in front of a learned society saying things like that. It's just amazing. But what keeps me returning to Goethe, though, is how he juxtaposes his weird scientific observations with freakishly precise descriptions of the phenomenology of color. In other words, he was right about how we experience color. He often got the why wrong. And Dean Judd, in his introduction to this reprint of Theory of Colors, went so far as to say, and quote, in view of the fact that Goethe's explanation of color makes no physical sense at all, one might wonder why it is considered appropriate to reissue the book, end quote. Now, Judd was only partly right. Since 1969, some of Goethe's science has actually been demonstrably proven as true, as physiologically accurate, but the majority of it is bunk. And so the reason we read and print Goethe, even if he's wrong, is because he's Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. We print him because it's worth trudging through his inconsistencies for the pleasure of reading what he got right, for the brazen and contagious enthusiasm with which he assumed that by observing color with an open mind, he could deduce a scientific explanation that refuted Newton, which was his main goal. And I print Goethe for the simple reason that he's a man after my own heart. That's how I approach life. I want to be able to just look at things and understand them, So Colored Objects is a chapter from Theory of Colors that deals with chromatic after images. The idea that if you stare at a red circle long enough, I'm not checking my email, I'm getting my timer ready. But if you stare at a red circle long enough and then take it away, you'll see a green circle appear in its place. And what I love about natural philosophy books from the 18th and 19th centuries is that they don't just report on outcomes, they describe experiments that the reader can perform themselves and verify or disprove in their own home, usually. And so Colored Objects is a textbook or a pathway for learning, and we're going to do one of those experiments right now. And so I'm going to flip the slide, and there's going to be a red circle, and I want you to stare at it in focus for 20 seconds. The way you'll know the 20 seconds is up is I will have flipped to a white screen, and keep staring where you are looking, and in a few seconds, a green circle will appear. Go. And I'll, just remember to stay focused on it, look at it, appreciate the beauty of red. And we're almost there. Keep focusing. So, I love that. When I started work on the book, though, this is where we get into practice. I was caught up on Goethe's inaccurate science rather than his experiments. I didn't want to illustrate content that was wrong, and so I first went off on a tangent of making a book in which I didn't illustrate the text so much as make a series of complementary prints, images that would explore my own experience of color. So this is one spread, for instance, and I think it's a beautiful spread. It just has nothing to do with Goethe. And it has everything to do with me, and that's not quite what I meant by ideal book. This was another experiment where I was going to print the text slightly off register in complementary colors, and that would just give people headaches. And so when I put these prints beside Goethe's text, they felt like non sequiturs. Rather than resulting in a unified whole, the book seemed to be split down the middle. I was also struggling typographically. Since the text was written in the early 19th century, I felt that I should design the book's type to look like what an early 19th century reader would expect. And notice here, 15 years after my epiphany, I'm still having trouble putting aside feeling that I should design and embracing what I wanted to design. But it didn't take long, though, before I realized that nothing else about the book looked like it was from the early 19th century. And in fact, the boldness of the images needed a type that would visually balance with them. And so as Emily described, this is my typeface that I call Rapid Stencil. While debating how to move forward, the artist Emily Martin came for a visit, and we spent a day in my studio messing around. There she is at my board shear. And you see on the table in front, there's a book structure there that's sort of star form. It should be on the table next door. And from the very beginning, the one thing I knew is I wanted to make a book that was also a colored object in itself, not just that just talked about them. But during my conversations with Emily, it became clear that I was moving in the wrong direction and that I should concentrate on illustrating the phenomena Goethe described rather than his scientific commentary. I knew that I wanted there to be movable parts in the book, so during for those of you who don't know, Emily Martin is a master paper engineer and just incredibly talented. And so I had her there and I was like, teach me. And so she taught me things like the changing circle, which these aren't quite done right, but they set me on the course of making a book in which I would illustrate both sides of Goethe's experiments, the proposition and the outcome, using fantastically elaborate elements that would all need to be made by hand. So for instance, the problem with this single spread would require 12 press runs, at least 7 different laser cut passes through a laser cutter, and then the hand assembly of 6 separate movables with adhesions on both front and back of the paper. So that wasn't going to work, but if I was going to go in this direction at all, it also meant that I was going to have to bind the book myself, which is not something I normally do. I used to do it, but because if I were to pay a bookbinder to make this, it would just be way too expensive. So, oops, don't get to see that yet. I flew out to Iowa City for a binding lesson from Emily, and it was there that the final book came into being. While showing the maquette to Emily's movable book students, one of them asked, "Why are you illustrating the outcome of the experiments? Why don't you let people experience the outcomes for themselves?" So rather than following a print of a red circle with a print of a green circle, as I had intended to do, just leave the succeeding page blank and let the green circle appear, as Goethe insisted it would. And with that one question, everything clicked into place and colored objects found its final form. And this is, everything I've just described to you is radically different from how I've made books for the last 35 years. I do not collaborate. I don't like people's input. I don't, I don't ask people to come to my studio and tell me how to do things. And so I like to think that I'm maturing. And I enjoyed the process so much that there's something more collaborative in my approach now. So I think it was a big step. And so now I'm just going to walk through the book, and like I said, I wanted it to be a colored object. And so I went to a makerspace, learned how to use a laser cutter, cut these 2 pieces of fluorescent acrylic, and then watched YouTube videos to learn how to adhere them to each other. And then this is the book. I love things like the book inside. When you get the book in the slipcase, you think the book is green, and you take it out, and the book is blue. And as you pull it out, there's this wonderful glowing edge of green light that's sort of like, it's escaping from the ooze, and then the book is bound in such a way that every spread can lay perfectly flat. You can't really see it in this image, but the colored objects is printed slightly out of register in 2 complementary colors, gives a kind of fun aspect. And then, this is your book. This is the 13 color page, which is always fun. And I just want to show, how I work. This is my drawing of that color circle, color wheel, on a scrap of paper that I use to cover my work tables in my studio, and which has now found a lovely home here in the Library of Congress. And there's the woman in the pub. And so this is the one experiment that I couldn't let people do for themselves because it involves running back and forth in front of a field of poppies at sunset. And so I made 3 Volvels, and you can sort of see, you get the idea of what's happening. And so, but getting to this point was extremely difficult. At first I thought we have to be modern, and so I started with, red, orange circles. He also talks about them, seeing them next in front of a gravel path. So blue-gray background, red, orange circles, and then I was like, it's a little too severe. So I went to the idea of the Volvels, and so this is a panel that has trials with all kinds of different papers to see which will hold up well, etc. And then there's my first little sketch of the poppy form instead of a circle, and then we ended up with poppies. We keep going. He talks about looking through panes of blue glass. So we've got blue glasses, and then green glass. We got green glasses. When I first started, I was like, I have to make everything myself. So there you go. It's so stupid. They're so bad. They're so bad, and they would have been so awful. And it's just there's a whole company that, they would only sell me the minimum was 500 pairs for $12. And these would have taken me weeks to make, One of the things I love about Goethe is how tactile he was. He was so involved in the physical world. He would hire painters to paint views for him, but he would set up next to them and paint next to them just to see what he could. He was for this experiment, he doesn't just say, look at a white square on a yellow background. He says, put a piece of white paper on a yellow background and put a piece of yellow paper on a white background. So although this doesn't look probably like Goethe would have made it, that's what I did. I did exactly what he said. They're pieces of paper. This is one of the red-green experiments, which you just have to see in person. This is an orange-blue experiment. I will say that in the past, I have not always been the most generous in my comments about people who use pop-ups and movables. I was wrong. They're really hard to make work well. They really are. And I just made 2 for this book, and I was like, never again. And so people who make pop-ups and movables deserve our respect and our praise. This is another green-red experiment. This is the road in front of the field that turns so you can see it both in front of green, and it's a very Albers experiment. And then the end of the book, the result is justly called harmony. So thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, so it seems like we have about 8 minutes for questions. But again, as I mentioned, all the speakers will be in the adjacent room. So if you don't get your question in right now, that's fine. You will have plenty of time to go ahead and ask. But let's go ahead and open up the floor. We have some folks with microphones, so go ahead and get that hand up high. And then we do ask that you speak into the microphone. We are recording, so we want our folks that are beaming in to be able to hear the questions.
This is for Russell. In terms of the general book market, do you have a favorite edition of like a classic lit from a specific publisher or anything like that that you think has the nicest typeface or cover?
From a commercial publisher today? In general. Well, yeah, I would say like most things printed between 1510 and 1540 I really like. My favorite sort of series of commercial books are the Gallimard publications, the cream-colored sort of soft paper-bound books with the borders around and the big red title in the middle, and then the artist's name, the author's name. But I mean, there's so much good type design going on now that I would say the books that I don't care for most in the public market are books that use revivals of letterpress types instead of using contemporary typefaces made by new designers. Yeah.
This is for Sarah. So much of your print work is very linear. It's quite clear that we're looking at a series of strokes of lines. Do you ever consider sketching and illustrating as opposed to printmaking? And would there be a difference in your mind between the two?
Do you mean like using then a digital or offset version to reproduce it?
Yeah, I guess that would have to be at the outcome, right? Yes, so it's not
Right.
handmade as opposed to machine-made. But is that the issue, or is there a quality difference between pulling a print as opposed to doing a good inked line drawing?
I think it's something that works in both ways. So my medium feeds how I draw, and that's how I learned to draw. So now when I work in ink, for example, I'm using a pen that I dip in ink, and again, making lots of lines. So it's how I learned to work, but it's now what I prefer as well. And there is something about the quality of lines and marks that I just can't get enough of. I'm going to do it forever and ever.
In our kitchen, we have a beautiful pen and ink drawing by Sarah, so I can say that they're just as great as her etchings. Yeah.
I think there is a place for offset printing for more mass production techniques, and they can be beautifully done, and it just depends what outcome you want in terms of how widely do you want a book's reach to be and that kind of thing. So there's definitely a place for that. It's not all about hand making everything.
Hello. Oh, that was loud. Hi. This is a question for both Sarah and Russell. Both of you talked about moments in your practice where you realized you had to pivot. How long did it take you to get to that realization? Is it like, okay, I've been working on this for an hour and I'm done, or is it like days? Can you talk a bit more about that?
That's an extremely complicated question. My experience is that it's all of the above. Sometimes, when I started work on interstices and intersections, I was walking over the Williamsburg Bridge with this printer, Gaylord Chenelec, and when we started our walk on the bridge, I was going to make a book called 26 Propositions, and about halfway up the bridge, I finished my description to Gaylord of what it was, and he said, "God, that sounds like a lot of work. Why don't you do 13? And something in that moment, I realized there were 13 books of Euclid, and I've been using geometry in my work for 20 years, and I had never done a book about geometry. And by the time we arrived in Manhattan, I was doing Euclid. And but then the previous one, the change I described earlier, took like 15 years. Yeah.
I would have to echo Russell in that. I have a pivot in every work I do. So this was just an example because it's a really concrete example where all these things are not working and I can say, okay, I could compromise and make this work and it'll be okay, but I really don't want to make something that's just okay. But every time I start off on drawing, I start off on a project, I have to do this full circle thing of I have an idea of what I'm doing, I try to do it, it doesn't work. But there are moments where you can get to that place and then from there on, you're sort of clicked in and you don't have to redo it all the time.
Hello, over here. A question for both of you as well. I'm curious about your edition sizes and how you come to those and how you choose them. How many you want to make initially, and if you end up at that number, that process.
It's of several factors, partially monetary. I started making editions of about 20 when I was first making books. Pulling an edition of 20 etchings is not that hard. But then I was selling out too much, so I doubled it. My editions are generally around 40. That means I'm printing, for an edition of 40, I'm printing 50 because I need proofs for mess-ups and that kind of thing. So Baba Yaga, I think there were 17 plus plates, each in an edition of 50. So it took me about a month to print. So it's a combination of how much printing is there, what edition size can I physically pull in a reasonable amount of time, how much is it going to cost me to bind, and then how much can I reasonably expect to sell. So it's several calculations that I don't actually have a very scientific answer for.
Yeah, there's nothing really scientific about it. I make my edition size is about 75 usually, because that's about how many books I sell when I make a book. And it takes a little time, but that's sort of the outer limit with an expensive book of what I can sell. And every once in a while I go above that for some reason, and usually I regret it, but not always. And then I've recently started a series of books that I just have photocopied, and those I start with 250 copies, and they're $10. They're fun books, but yeah, it took a long time. I started about 20, 25, and then slowly worked up to 75. Yeah.
So this is a question for Emily. You said you've gone from being an archivist and a curator to an educator. Can you talk a little bit about the programs, how that works with your library and institution, what they're about, who's your audience, when can I come and see them, that kind of stuff?
Casual overview, absolutely. Thanks, Beth. So yeah, I've transitioned now to working at a university, at a large research university, which is very different than getting to work somewhere like the Library of Congress. But it means that my primary audience is going to be students, which is a total joy. So that's generally who I tend to be working with. And when I'm taking this kind of experience, what I'm really trying to do with students is to help them understand process, not only how something is made, but also the process of how we engage with it. What was the question you had about programming?
So how do you design the programs, at least for graduate students, undergraduate?
It's primarily undergraduate. We do have graduate students as well, and we're really trying to have the library be a place where students feel comfortable, that they feel at home. We really underscore the fact that we're a library and not a museum, so the materials are all there for them to touch, including our artist books, everything like that. But we also really want to encourage people to work creatively with library materials, particularly archival materials. So I've recently started a series of doing zine workshops with students where we make surrogates of a bunch of stuff that we have in the archive, provide it for the students. I got a grant for a zine kit that now is on a little cart that you can bring around with you, really encouraging people to be in conversation with texts and history and all of that. And then the fun part is that we get to acquire those zines and keep them in our collection, which is a really wonderful way to get student voices into the archive that we would not otherwise have. So it's a very big job. It's still relatively new. I've only been there for a couple of years, but it's been a really big joy. Thanks, Beth.
Okay, let's give our speakers one last round of applause.